The article, Self-Driving Car Dilemmas revealed that moral choices are not universal, confronts the issue on how we can't have a rigorous consensus on what decisions autonomous cars will have to make. To try to answer this question empirically, a survey called The Moral Machine laid out 13 scenarios where someone dies. From this, participants from all over the world were tasked with choosing what decisions to make. The survey contains all different kinds of groups: animals, humans, young, old, even different economic and social statuses. The surprising result was that different groups weighted different things drastically. In this infographic, we can see some interesting things. Something I'd like to point out is how typically more southern countries, where there's a larger wealth inequality, they valued higher statuses much greater, and also valued sparing women much higher. Additionally, eastern countries were not the greatest fan of children's lives. Now, there has been some controversy regarding this paper, as some academics have stated how the study is unrealistic because the chances of having to make these decisions, such as a car driven with only animals versus hitting the president of a country, was completely unrealistic. And to a lesser extent, other scenarios were also improbable of happening, meaning these decisions wouldn't have to be necessarily made. But I still think that it raises a good question on which we have to decide upon. When a self-driving car has to choose between lives, it will be premeditated, and we have to decide on what as a society we think is okay. Another article by the New Yorker talks about how the moral machine brings up an interesting point. When making any of these moral decisions, who should be allowed to contribute for this? For example, what would happen if a car manufacturer decided to prioritize the life of customers over other people? Or if a government, such as China, decided to value those with a higher social credit over those with a lower score? This moral corruption will come at cost of people's lives, and this must be regulated carefully. What is probably the easiest ethical framework to solve this problem with is probably utilitarianism. Simply put, this would just result in whichever choice saves the most lives with no preference for passengers versus pedestrians. This, of course, still does have its own issues. Because should we value a rich, successful business person's life over a homeless person's? This question continues to get dicey the farther and farther we go with heuristics on deciding the value of different lives. I think ultimately, no ethical framework can give a satisfactory moral answer, which is something both of the articles represent. Alright, so I know this is weird because it's a video presentation, but I'd like to do something interactive. Start off by raising your hand and keeping it up for as long as you agree with the premise, and lower it once you no longer agree. Keep your hand up if you would prioritize a self-driving car with no passengers over the life of 5 people. Now look around. If anyone doesn't have their hand up, they're either refusing to participate or are kind of messed up for this one. Okay, now seriously, keep your hand up if you would prioritize 2 passengers' lives over 1 pedestrian. What about prioritizing 1 passenger over 1 pedestrian? 2 pedestrians? 3 pedestrians? 5 pedestrians? Alright, you can put your hands down now. Now, for whichever was the last car you kept your hand up for, would you feel comfortable buying this car and using this as your daily form of transportation? I'd like to imagine that at least for a majority of the class, your decision does slightly change. This is just an experiment in theory, but this is a real issue when it comes to the market. If a company decides to say that a car will prioritize 2 pedestrians over the passenger, most consumers would rather buy a competitor who will prioritize the passenger over everything else. This raises an obvious ethical issue, but without regulation, consumers will vote with their wallets for which the best individual outcome comes to them. Another discussion question is if we should improve these heuristics and how much information we're actually giving the car. For example, should the car be programmed to try to detect and guess social stature, political, economic standings, or should we just have the car be relatively ignorant in making these decisions? And then also, let's say in the case that a self-driving car does actually end up choosing to kill someone. Who is responsible for that? Is it the passenger who's at fault, who didn't actually have influence on the car? Is it the car designer? Is it the government for allowing that regulations, etc.? In my opinion, what's best going forward is having some sort of centralized association where standards are set for what is thought as best. Another good news is hopefully this problem shouldn't be as relevant as collisions or accidents are predicted to decrease as self-driving cars become more and more widely used. However, with self-driving cars beginning to enter the market, we need to understand where we stand on this issue and how we're going to handle this going forward.